Good evening. I'm Marta Moreno Vega, President and founder of Creative Justice Initiative. And welcome to a series of conversations this month that are designed to take us through a series of conversations that will contextualize the advocacy that those of us that are in community, that are community-based leaders and builders of institutions have been involved with since, who knows, of most of us in the first panel, 40, 50 years. But the struggle for justice, the struggle for equality, for racial justice has been ongoing. And therefore, it is important at this historical moment that we look at what has happened, we look at the now, and we take full advantage of what the movement for Black Lives Matter has put into motion. And we assure equity for everyone, that we assure the participation of everyone, that caging families at the border, killing people because of lack of paying attention to this virus that is destroying so much of our community is unacceptable. And because we have fought for justice all of our lives and will continue to do so, we invite you to be part of these conversations that are about contextualizing the moment of now and taking us forward as a community of diverse races, diverse cultures, diverse experiences, because we understand that we are one and disenfranchisement is not acceptable. And at this moment, we have one voice, and that is the voice of vote, and that is the voice of assuring a safe future for our children. So thank you for being with us. And I introduce you to Laurie Sims, who's the moderator for this first panel. And she's a friend, curator, writer, and thought provoker. And we have, I think the first conference we did was at the start of the Caribbean Cultural Center when we were looking at the inequity of funding to our institutions in the 70s. And now this conversation continues in different ways and at different times. So welcome. Laurie?
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. For this panel, which is Sustaining the Spiritual Power of Cultural Institutions, Why We Built Our Organizations, we'll be discussing with four stellar veterans for the fight for cultural justice, how we came of age intellectually, emotionally, and professionally in the context of the liberation movements of the 1970s. The movement articulated the racial and cultural injustices we felt, maybe didn't have the words for at that time, but it was clear that as visual artists, curators, and art historians, we had to initiate advocacy groups and institutions that reflected the spirit, the aesthetic legacy of our communities, which was ignored and overlooked by the artistic mainstream. Before I introduce our panel very briefly, because their resumes are about 20 pages long, so I'm just going to give you a little bit. I also wanted to acknowledge the fact that we're linking in from the Northeast, the North, Southwest, and the West Coast, but we'd like to acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral lands we stand and live. So joining us this evening is our Margo Machida, who is an artist, curator, cultural critic, and professor emerita of art history and Asian studies at the University of Connecticut. She was born and raised in Hawaii and has lectured widely on her research nationally and internationally, and served as a curatorial advisor for the inaugural 2017 Honolulu Biennial. She's published widely on Asian art and visual culture. Next, we have with us Amalia Mesa-Baines, who's professor emerita in the Visual and Public Art Department at California State University at Monterey Bay, and a distinguished MacArthur Fellow. As an artist and critic, she's done pioneering work depicting, documenting, and interpreting Chicano traditions in Mexican-American art, and is a leader in the field of community arts. Joan Quick-to-See Smith is an enrolled Salish member of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Nation in Montana. She's an educator, artist, and critic, and her paintings and prints combine appropriated imagery from commercial slogans and signage, art history, and personal narratives in an intimate visual language that conveys an insistent socio-political commentary. And last but not least, since 1968, Napoleon Jones-Henderson has been involved with the artist collective Afro Cobra, African Commune of Bad, Relevant Artists, which originated in Chicago. He is particularly known for his large pictorial weaving tapestries that feature topographical elements that enhance the message set against weaving patterns and portraits of African Americans. So the first thing we want to do is have each one of our panelists talk about how they got here. What got them into the art world at a time when it wasn't usual for us to be there. So I'd like to give the floor first to Margo to get our conversation started, to talk about her experiences as an Asian American in the art world in the late 60s and early 70s. Margo.
Thank you. Wonderful to be here. It's a great honor to share my personal story and also to hear what inspires each of you to carry your work forward. My engagement with Asian American art and cultural activism really developed organically from the time I came to New York in 1968 to attend New York University. This was a period of intense political upheaval. And I arrived directly from this primarily Asian, semi-rural community in Hawaii. And this radical change compelled me to contend with issues of difference and otherness for the first time. Now, I was raised in the only state with an Asian majority, and I confronted being transformed into this racialized minority on the East Coast, and also grappling with these common perceptions of Hawaii as this remote tropical paradise. And I found such exoticized notions especially incongruous, since for most of my childhood, the islands were still a U.S. territorial possession and a major military base, because they were annexed in 1898 following the overthrow of the indigenous monarchy by American settlers. And growing up in this environment that was very distanced from and yet thoroughly enmeshed with the U.S. presence in the Pacific, I later realized that this background closely informed my alignments with other people of color. And indeed, around the time I left, the grassroots indigenous movement arose to revive traditional Hawaiian language and culture and to seek self-determination and sovereignty. Now, I was swiftly caught up in this torrent of activism, arriving in New York when the anti-war, the counterculture, and the identity movements were in full sway, and only months after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Now, by the 70s, I was also drawn to Manhattan's downtown art scene, and especially the alternative art spaces where many artists of color were exhibiting. And this includes Kenkeleba House, the Alternative Museum, and also I went up to the Studio Museum in Harlem. Now, my growing contact with African American artists and curators, including Lowery Sims, I'll give her a shout out, was a primary inspiration for my decision to pursue painting. Through such relationships, I became aware that parallel art worlds, informal support networks, and budding institutions existed alongside the elite precincts of a largely white-dominated art mainstream. My direct involvement, I just disappeared. My direct involvement with Asian American artists and writers only began in the late 70s after I moved to a loft in Manhattan's Chinatown. That's where I met cultural activists in the local community arts organizations. This includes members of the pioneering art group Basement Workshop, and later the Asian American Arts Center. Now, Basement was formed in 1970, the matrix of multiculturalism, the rise of ethnic studies, the anti-war movement, feminism, and third world anti-colonial struggles. And Asian Americans were very much involved with all of these movements. Now, since the images and the histories of Asians in America went largely unrecognized by society at large, Basement's members regarded arts as a means of collectively coming to voice, and also affirming solidarity with other people of color. So my contact with these groups exerted a formative influence on my view of the artist as social actor, whose role is not simply to produce work, but also to act as a theorist, an educator, a curator, a documentarian, and an organizer. Now, on the West Coast, projects by Asian American artists likewise provided powerful models for collective action. By the late 80s, Filipino American artist and activist Carlos Villa launched Sources that Made a Distinct Majority, an intensive multi-year series of symposia at the San Francisco Art Institute that focused on critical issues facing artists of color. And yet by the 70s and 80s, we also witnessed a surging Asian migration that was brought about by the abolition of restrictive federal immigration quotas, the flood of refugees following South Vietnam's collapse in 1975, and the establishment of US diplomatic relations with China. Now this led to a vast Asian influx, including a major wave of Chinese artists and intellectuals in the 80s that transformed the internal dynamics of Asian America and also drew art world attention to contemporary Asian art. So New York was a major magnet for these artists, including figures like the human rights activist Ai Weiwei. Now, recognizing these rapidly evolving conditions on the ground, it became increasingly clear that new types of forums were needed where the American-born and the recent arrivals could dynamically engage with one another. And in 1990, with artists Ken Chu and Bing Lee, I co-founded Godzilla, Asian American Art Network. Godzilla was a loose-knit artist collective where artists, curators, and writers from different Asian backgrounds shared their work and ideas. Now, departing from existing community art organization models, Godzilla chose not to institutionalize or to be based in an ethnic enclave. Instead, the group's open slideshows, public forums, and exhibitions moved freely among artist lofts and alternative spaces throughout New York City, routinely attracting hundreds to their gatherings. And Godzilla gained early notoriety by sending an open letter to major New York City museums that challenged the lack of Asian American inclusion in the 1991 Whitney Biennial. This resulted in a meeting with Whitney's director, who at that time was David Ross, and the curators. Now, although it disbanded in 2001, Godzilla continues to inspire new generations of artist activists, and the Museum of Chinese America is now organizing a retrospective exhibition. Thank you.
Thank you, Margo. To bring into the conversation to talk about her experiences of finding space and place within the Mexican American community and the growth of the Chicano movement, and how specific aesthetic was key to her artwork and that of her fellow and sister artists. Please welcome Amalia Mesa-Baines.
Okay, thank you. Happy to be there. Waiting to go on the screen, I guess. I'm not seeing myself, but I want to say that I knew that I would be an artist from my childhood on, growing up as a Mexican descended child in California, even in an era where discrimination still existed. So I often refer to those early years coming into the Chicano community and finding the Galeria as a kind of, I was lost and I was found. I look back on that now and I realize that it was what Bell Hooks has termed a home place, a place of resistance, a place where you are protected and where you find alliance with other people who share your story. So the Galeria de la Raza, when I would say I started there in the early 70s, not a few years after they opened. And it was during the sort of the high part of the Chicano movement. And it was a movement that really valued both resistance and affirmation. So for me, the notion that it was a term coined by Tomasi Butterfeld and myself, the notion of cultural reclamation meant that we went back to our families and we tried to find the traditions and the practices that they had engaged in that we had largely separated from in our attempts to be American, which of course was a disastrous failure because no one ever believed we were American. And it was made clear to us in many ways over the years. So the Galeria became then, as I say, the home place. The place where I met other artists, people like Rupert Garcia, Carmen Lomas Garza, Esther Hernandez, And it was run by two founders who were probably the first generation of actual directors. And that was Ralph Madariaga and Renee Yanez. Now, I lucked out because at that time I was in a program called Teacher Corps, which was a national program to bring people of color into inner city schools. And my mentor was Yolanda Garfias-Wool. And Yolanda was Oaxaqueña, Tijuana, who was raised in San Francisco, but who lived part of the time each summer at home in Oaxaca. And she introduced me to Ralph. My very first community organization was actually Casa Hispana de Bellas Artes, and that was 1969, when we sent the first Chicano show to Delano. And remember, that's a time when the farm worker movement for justice and equity is at its probably most tempestuous. So sending that artwork was my first step into that field. And what I learned at the Galeria and what has stayed with me all these years was not just a sense of belonging, but a sense of belonging with purpose. And the purpose was social justice. That has never left me. And in many ways, I think when I look at those early years, what we did at the Galeria, it really embodies that moment of self-recognition and self-determination. As a generation that experienced the rupture of racism, we had turned our back on our family's practices, and so finding them again in this moment of resistance and affirmation led us through the 70s and 80s to address issues that were part and parcel of the broader community of Mexican-descended people and Latino people, Central American, and those were the goals of equity and social justice. So a lot of the distinctions about the exhibitions, the performances, the residencies, the collaborations were based on that twin concept of justice and equity. And the other thing we were doing was creating a missing history. We had been seen as foreigners, as outsiders, and so the decision to reclaim our sense of origin as people of the Americas was really central, not just to the Galeria, to so many other organizations, the Mexican Museum, the Mission Cultural Center. And I still think that in some ways that job is not done. We have had waves and waves of immigration, and each group that comes in brings with it another set of beliefs and practices and a kind of knowledge. And what we're involved in now, I think, is the transference of the intergenerational knowledge that was built in those early years to the new communities that are engaging in the society now. One of the things I'm most proud of is that I think we established early on what's now being called a global perspective. We call it hemispheric. We have partnerships with artist groups all across the Americas, in Venezuela, in Cuba, in Mexico, and in Central America. And we have to remember that in those 80s were the wars of Central America, the civil wars. So we were receiving massive amount of students in our public schools from those countries. And it was a time of great disruption. And it evidenced itself in the illnesses and mental problems that many of our communities were facing. So in some ways, those early years were also years in which we took into account that art serves as a function to heal and to mend. And so that, I think, is how I was led to the form of ofrendas and altares. I found my way really to a role. And I say this now in retrospect, as if we were sort of like a small little army, and people signed up for different things. And there was the Royal Chicano Air Force, so they were our pilots. And the Galeria, in many ways, took the lead in the reaffirmation of the Days of the Dead, the celebration of our families and our ancestors. And it also became a tool, a political tool, for recognizing the history of struggle both within the Americas and within the United States. So the Days of the Dead during the war years and during the years of Reagan and the years of Bush became a vehicle for resistance, for controversy, and for knowledge. So I look at my own work that moved from the early altars and the offerings to the dead to eventually other forms of sacred space, which had to do with the descansos, or the resting places that you see when you drive along the roads, the front yard shrines, the capillas, I took all of those original sacred spaces and I began to meld them together to give voice to other histories. When I think of myself as an artist, as I still do, I think of myself as an artist within a community of artists. And I often get asked by younger people, why do you still use the term Chicana or Chicanette, as I may often use? And that's because it is the root of the beginning of an identity that I built for myself with these people, and I feel linked to them to this day. So the comadres that I share my history with, people like Judy Baca, Ested, Carmen Lamas Garza, Patsy Valdez, all of those women are women who have led organizations, who have developed on the forefront of issues of justice. And now in the new generation, which I think comes out of some of the decisions we made in the 90s, the new generation is really looking at our organizations from a point of view of analysis of structural systems of racism. They're looking at public policy, and they're seeing that in this chaos that we're in, this pandemic, these race wars, the whole of it, that our community-based organizations act as first responders. We are on the forefront. We're beginning to develop new models of mixed usage of low-income housing and community organization. So if I talk about my own work, I talk about it within the context of that early history, that home place, and that community that has supported me for all of these years. I've always said that Chicano networks are as broad as one can ever imagine. You can almost land in any city and pick up a phone and call somebody there who knows somebody there who will get you to the organization, and you will be welcome and you will be at home. Because these home places, even though they have been definitely impacted by things I think we'll talk about later, the censorship battles, the closing of Expansion Arts and NEA, all of the things we face, they are still there. And I feel that our conversation today about how they were built is just the beginning of talking about how we sustain them. So I have great admiration for all the other communities that we have had the chance to collaborate with. Asian Americans with Kearney Street Workshop, the American Indian Center, all of those places that we had as our partners over those years have helped us to frame our ideas about who we are as artists and activists and what it is we intend to do in the future. And when I look at the other panel members, I'm touched by the memories we share of the many, many battles we've been in, all the times we had to stand up and claim the space and shout in somebody's face or make a long list of demands or create a manifesto or whatever was required. And everybody on this panel today, I have shared at some point that movement and that sense of well-being as truly committed artist activists. Thank you.
Thank you, Amalia. Thank you. So Napoleon, I wanted you to talk about your educational experiences and how they form your activism and involvement in the AfroCobra group and the impact of that group on institutions that were built by African Americans. And maybe this is the moment we should show your slides. What do you think?
Well, yes, you could do that if you like. But yes, as you say.
Okay.
First of all, my educational experience in Chicago was probably not too different than most other Black people and other non-European origin people in this country. Growing up in Chicago was, as we call it, up south as opposed to down south. They were the same thing. You were just up above the quote so-called Mason-Dixon line, but for me, the Mason-Dixon line is the Canadian border. I grew up in Chicago. I went to Shirley, an all-segregated school system in the great city of Chicago, and my entire life was still spent in that type of a system. But it was not, in reflection, it was not hindering, because the individuals who were our instructors, individuals who were people who worked in the janitorial staff and in the lunchroom because they cooked lunch when I was in school. And the people, it was like being at home going to school. Because the teachers looked out for us in the same way that our parents did, and the larger community felt that way. But however, I was raised in a family that had a very affirmative and positive attitude about themselves and about the possibilities of what our being all of my siblings, cousins, and all this like, what our futures would be like. My family, they all migrated from Mississippi and Alabama to Chicago, and they were accustomed to having a very strong sense of self, a very strong sense of ownership, in the sense that my grandparents and uncles and such were all skilled craftsmen in some trade or another. And many of them also worked two jobs. They worked that particular skill, which they owned their own companies, and they also worked at various factories, such as the steel mill and Pullman car manufacturing. My grandfather worked there his entire life. They believed in owning things, and so they bought their own homes because they came from the rural life in the South, which they owned their own property. So, with that sense of ownership, which grounds you in yourself as a person and what you can do, your choices are unending. My teachers at my high school, George Washington Carver High School, were an extraordinary cadre of individuals. Not only were they our instructors, but they were also our friends and colleagues. Because as we became older and became closer to young adulthood, they began to transition us or to help us make that transition and seeing ourselves beyond just simply being young people living and growing up in Chicago. All of them, of course, for the most part, attended HBCUs. And so, as such, they had a very important perspective on education and intelligence, in the sense that everyone was equally as intelligent. One just simply had to cultivate that intelligence and move forward with a sense of positivity. And so, as the image up there of the Afro Cobra, all of these images reflect on the attitudes that were prevalent in Chicago. In Chicago, uh, the benefit of the teachers I had at George Washington Carver High School was unbelievable because many of them had attended not only HBCUs but other institutions as well. But one of the rich aspects and treasures that they brought to us as students was that they had studied under people like Du Bois and George, oh boy, rheumatism of the brain. Uh,
Helen,
I they had studied under many of the great individuals who we know as scholars and creative individuals uh, throughout those institutions, because those institutions were a treasure trove in the sense that those individuals could not teach at the quote white universities and colleges, although they were many times uh, uh, much more qualified. But we gathered the benefit of those individuals by having them in our small communities, and they taught us things that we would not have gotten otherwise had they not themselves been the recipients of those kinds of benefits. And so I had teachers who were friends with people like Lorraine Hansberry. And I had teachers and people with me that were Hoyt Fuller, who was the editor of Black World, people like Oscar Brown Jr., Margaret Burroughs, of course, we all know Margaret Burroughs, and people like Gwendolyn Brooks,
Uh-huh.
and Mahalia Jackson. Even Sammy Davis Jr. came to our school and performed in the gymnasium, with his little self. I mean, the multi-talented person that he was. And even people such as Du Bois and Carter G. Woodson were individuals who my teachers had relationships with in some manner and or another, and those kinds of things were shared with us. So we came up with a rich education grounded in the extraordinary history of African people in the Western Hemisphere. And they also embedded in us the understanding that we were, granted, we lived in a very small community, that we were citizens of the world. And they gave us the benefit of understanding of that citizenship of the world, in the sense that many of them have lived abroad, some in Africa, some in Europe and other South American and Caribbean countries. And they even had spent time in Ireland, for example, with various demonstrations of the miners and such there, seeking to have equity in life from the British Empire. And so those kinds of things were embedded in us. And so AfriCobra was a natural manifestation that comes out of that kind of a grounding of an education that is not only academic, but is also cultural. And so what we experience, we being all of us as individual artists, as we travel through the art exhibitions and various other activities throughout Chicago, we had the opportunity to see that if we were going to be creative individuals and be of worth to our community, then we needed to take a deep look at the values that existed within the community that were uh, the foundation from which all of our creative aspects come from. I mean, the aspect of the African aesthetic and the sense in which we have continued to cultivate that and use and live out of that ethos right there in Chicago. And so what we looked at and decided was that we would have uh, an aesthetic and a set of aesthetic principles and a philosophy which would drive the images that we created. And for 52 years, this year will be 2021 will be 53 years we have been together as a collective. And the name African Afro-Cobra means the African Commune of Bad Relevant Artists. And that's bad before the Jackson Five got it just across the border in Gary, Indiana. You know, so we did that sort of stuff. But in Chicago, you had many institutions. And Chicago is noted for having those. One of those being the DuSable Museum of African American History, IPE, which is the Institute of Positive Education, started by FDR Martha Booty, the AACM, which is the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, and those brothers and sisters have populated the musical landscape all across the planet. We had also Darlene Blackburn and her dance troupe, the Kaumba Workshop, which was Val Gray Ward and her husband, who are extraordinary theater and writers. And we had things like the Southside Community Arts Center, which is, if my history serves me right, is the last of the existing WPA art centers that existed during that period of the 30s and 40s. 50s. So those individuals under the tutelage of persons like Dr. Margaret Burroughs and the other artists who she was very close to, like Elizabeth Cadillac and Charlie White and you can Samela Lewis, you name them all, they congregated, came through Chicago in some point in time, because many of them did a little time at the Art Institute of Chicago. And so they bought the building because they understood that longevity and equity for to any small or large degree is dependent upon oneself, not from the aegis or the graciousness of someone else. And so they bought that building, and that building has been the linchpin for virtually every artist out of the city of Chicago since the WPA going forward. And so I would just say that AfriCobra has been in the business of uh, 53 years now, creating positive images. And I mean, we've exhibited in beauty parlors and pool halls and all the little black guys. We actually, one of our first silk screen prints that we pulled, we did it at the Black Expo that Jesse Jackson's Operation Push held. We set up our silk screening operation right there in the expo, pulled the prints, and people were just amazed at how easy it was, but how difficult it was to get this done. And those were some of the first prints we did based on our first exhibition at the Studio Museum in Harlem under the directorship of Ed Sprigg back in 1970. We gave a ballot to all the people who came to the exhibition and asked them in the order of priority, choose 3 works that you would like to own if you could have them at home. And we told them that at our next exhibition at the Studio Museum, we would bring them back. We printed, I think all in all, we printed a total of 8 prints. They were larger than we wanted everything to be big. They were 30 by 40, and we learned from printing 30 by 40 silk screen prints of 8 to 14 colors was not an easy thing to do. And moreover, we printed the price for the piece, the prints in the print. They were $10 a piece. But they ain't $10 a piece now if you can even find one, you know.
That's true.
But
Okay, Napoleon, wrap it up. Wrap it up.
and that was so that we could make sure that people would not be, you know, abused by galleries and bookstores and other places when they got their work, and so people have them.
So you can see when we get our group going, this could go on forever, but we want to make sure everybody gets their voice in. So I want to move on now to John. John, can you talk to us about what resources there were for you as a Native American artist, and a Native American artist was a woman when you were finding your way? What were your experiences in school? What activist groups did you encounter and affiliate with? And who did you look to for support and encouragement when you were coming up back in the day, as they say?
Thanks to you, Lowry, and to Marta. This is a great honor to be here, especially with my old pals here. Napoleon's going to be one of my old pals soon. There's a thing about being with a group of elders like this, is that we're all walking encyclopedias of art history. And this is art history that's not in Jansen's book. It's not in any of the mainstream books. I mean, this is just rare footage of people who've participated, who've been there all along, always on the margins, always looking on, but also organizing, curating, and bringing art of the people, art of our communities into the mainstream in all varieties of ways. And when I heard Napoleon talk about the hanging art in the barber shop, I'm going to talk a little later about Gray Canyon here that I organized, and how I couldn't get into the galleries or the museums, and we went to the banks and churches. But what I want to do before I go there is I want to tell all of you a little bit about my background, because my background is really, truly not the American story. It's not even close to what your stories are. Sitting here listening to your childhoods, I mean, those were things I read about in books, but that I didn't experience. And so I want to give you a little piece of that. So I'm going to do that. And then later, when we go to the second topic, I'll talk about my organizing. So I wanted to tell you that I was born at the Indian Mission on my reservation, the Confederated Salish and Kootenai, 80 years ago. My father, who was 40 at the time, Salish, Métis, and Shoshone Bannock, was an itinerant worker and horse trader. And my mother was 15 years old. She was Cree, probably, and I'm sure, and I heard this in the family, that my father had raped her. They weren't married. My mother gave birth to my sister about 13 months later. And then soon after that, she joined the migrant workers who worked as field hands, and we never saw her again. I did meet her once when I was 25. Both of my parents were illiterate. So that sets a story here that's unlike any other story. And my story is of 30 years of survival before I could even begin to express myself as an artist, or even determine some parts of my future. My father kept us with him, and we lived on several Salish reservations in the Pacific Northwest. I remember living at the Nisqually Reservation near Tacoma under the old grandfather trees. 3 families lived in a one-room cabin, was customary, and there was no running water, no electricity, only an outhouse. My sister and I spent our days searching for food through the garbage piles behind the cabins, and stealing dried salmon if we could break into a smokehouse. We rolled into our blankets at night against the walls so the grown-ups who were drunk when they came in at night wouldn't step on us. My memory is mostly about being cold, hungry, having earaches and colds. I began work when I was 8 years old. That's when I got my Social Security card, as a field hand for the Japanese people who returned from the internment camps. And by the time I was 18, I had worked as a horse groomer, exerciser, mucker for my dad, chopped wood for him, worked the garden, worked in the crops year-round, packing peas, beans, strawberries, raspberries, rhubarb, tulips, daffodils. And then in high school, I worked as a waitress, and I worked in the canneries until I left for junior college. I had tried to take college courses in high school, but my school counselor, who was a white basketball coach, told me Indians didn't go to college. We lived right next door to the Salish, to the Puyallup reservation. And so there were Indians in school there too. Therefore, I had to take the vocational courses. My father taught me that it was dangerous to talk back or refute white people, that I could only think in my head. I can only like figure out what I was going to do, but I couldn't say it out loud. I would say that that was probably a seminal thing in my early training about how to get around systems, how to find my own way. Nobody in my family had ever gone to college. Most had never finished high school, and some, like my mother and father, were illiterate. I wanted to go to college in the worst way, and I wanted to be an artist, but what the counselor coach told me to do. So I had to take the vocational courses, and then I had to make it up later in junior college, make up the English and math. And I saw this as my mission in order to do what I was driven to do. And that was, I learned I had to go through the back door. I didn't have any credentials. I couldn't go through the front door. I had no power. I had nothing except what was in my head. So I realized that I could go through the back door unnoticed. Nobody would see me. Nobody would know what I was doing, to access any system, to go where I needed to go, to get done what I needed to get done.
John, we thought we'd show your art at this point. Would you like to talk about it briefly?
Sure. Well, we hear about 200 years of this and 200 years of that, and how, this country is old and everybody might have been here 400 years. Well, they weren't in the western part. From the Mississippi on, and where my reservation is, my great-grandmother had never seen a white person. So, from her, and she died in 1932, from my father, who was born in 1901, I had to say something about this. This is celebrate 40,000 years of American art. And these are from petroglyphs in Ontario, Canada. And the center of the world, for a lot of Indian people, the center of the world is where your reservation lies, where your land is. We are the only land-based people in this country. People who are Christians and who come from the Middle East, they have different kinds of animals, different kinds of plants that they know about. Only American Indians know the plants and animals and the holistic environment in this country. So that's what this painting is about. Turtle raised its back, and there we are. My sister, who was an addict and died of alcoholism and drugs, always had a lot of fear. So this is a story about my sister and the child within. She never grew. She always clung to her childhood. So I have a little figure inside the body there. Yeah. And one time I was traveling with my tribe, or elders of my tribe, down the Columbia River, because we were going to build a little museum. A museum, any kind of a museum, is like shows that you are there, you are a people. So we were working on that. So when I went down into the Columbia River, where there are a lot of petroglyphs and stuff, we're called Plateau Indians. And so this is the plateau here. Okay. Yeah, it's a map. It's another kind of map with pictographs and all that. Yeah, I make a lot. Everything has to do with the land. The land is everything.
Thank you, John.
Very great.
Well, I think that, like listening to all your history, even though I've known all of you more than 30, 40 years, it's really, really important to for people to sort of hear what a difference it was in terms of like the art world and our presence in the art world, at that time. So I remember when I started off at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, I started in community programs, and that was really an eye-opener for me to sort of really have contact with so many different communities that we were all serving, with this idea of bringing the largesse of the Met there. And that's where I established most of my relationships with you all and sort of coming there. And the important thing that was going on at the same time was that this was the moment where institutions were being built. The museum was barely 5 years old when I started. There were older institutions. Napoleon mentioned the Du Sable, and there were older institutions like that. But in New York City, it was very new. El Museo del Barrio was just, like catching on fire under the directorship of Marta Vega. I was working with the American Indian Community House and the Basement Workshop and all the people around there. So what I want us to talk now, and this is for all of you to sort of jump in, is to talk about what you found at the time when you were establishing organizations and activist groups. What was the funding situation like? What challenges did you have in getting funding? What kinds of funding sources were there? Federal, state, city, foundation, others? What attitudes did you encounter, and did you feel you were being funded equitably? Most of us are just, not really born administrators. So also talk about that transition to having to take on this kind of administrative role while you were sort of maintaining your identity as creative people. And I'll open it up and we can sort of, whoever wants to come first can do that.
Well,
Amalia, I'm just like, you want to start?
Yeah, I'll start. Well, AfriCobra and the entities you introduced, federal, city, so forth and so on, we elected from the very beginning from our motto primarily being that we were creating art for the people, not for the museums. And so all of the enterprises that we have engaged in throughout our 53-year career, we funded out of our pocket because we were first and foremost not willing to even entertain the possibility of having to cede or give up something to get something back, which was always less than what one needed and was just simply a token. And we were not interested in that because it was not the foundation we all came up on. We came up on a foundation of self-sufficiency and a sense of pride and steadfastness. So as John was talking about the turtle is an image I use all the time in my work, and the fortitude and the perseverance of the turtle. Granted, we may not be the fastest, but damn it, we for sure get there. And we did get there, and all of us are evidence of that. And so we chose not to go that route. And it has its benefits and it has its deficits. And the deficits were really minuscule by comparison to the benefits because we were grounded in our community. And that was not simply the community of Chicago, but the community of the entire African diaspora, because we were all over the place. And we had in Chicago at one time, they said there were more Nigerians in Chicago than there were in Nigeria, but nonetheless, we chose to fund our own entity. And we have been very successful at it. And we have learned the administrative aspect, which is, yes, as you indicated, Lowry, a painful journey. But the prick scars and evidence of that is right here with the five of us sitting here right now.
So what kinds of things did you do to sort of self-fund your organizations? Did you rely on the community? Did you rely on selling your art? Did you rely on, I don't know, doing?
It was all of that. Well, we didn't do anything that was outside of the realm of moving forward what we were about. We sold works, we created prints, we sold those prints, we gave various kinds of activities that would bring in money. And we also took all of it, for the most part, out of our own pocket. Because, and when I say out of our own pockets, it was not simply spending the money or putting the money forward to make product. It was what we did. It was our artistic practice. We worked as a collective. We worked as a commune. We would meet every other week for the most part, and we would meet virtually all day. I mean, our children grew up with us in the studio discussions, and we came and we worked. We brought our work in progress. We had our own critiques, one with the other, and these were critiques that, to this day, were based on the uplift of individuals. We were not speaking about. It was not an attack upon anyone, as we always say that if in order to be a member of AFRICOBRA, you got to be able to take it, because we don't cut it short. We don't soft pedal it. We tell you very honestly, and that honesty is about growth and love. And so we had occasions where we got contributions from people who admired what we were doing, who were supportive of it. And it was just simply the tenacity of how Black life always moved forward. We don't have a wealth. They say the Lord may not come when you call him, but he's always on time. And
Amalia?
Perspective of the Galeria de la Raza. I was never an administrator there, though Richard Baines, my husband, and I were on the board for 18 years. So I think we're at the beginning until we left.
Stalwarts.
Yeah, we were stalwarts. And most of all, what I know, because some of the times I helped with the fundraising, is that we were among many other Chicano organizations, and there were consortiums all through the Southwest that were being largely funded in terms of operations through the expansion arts wing of NEA. Well, that meant people like A.B. Spellman and Yvonne Coleman, and you all know who they are. And they were our backup. They were the ones who kept us going. And so during that period of time, we were able to pay salaries and take some of the rent out of that. Now, it's hard to believe, but the Galeria de la Raza, which is it is 50 years old, actually lived month to month renting, not even a lease. And as many of you may know, a couple of years ago, we were finally evicted because gentrification in San Francisco's Mission District is epic. So, but during those early years, we had that backdrop of NEA. But when the censorship battles in the 1980s came about and expansion arts collapsed, and we had to find our own way. By that time, the Galeria de la Raza had built something called Studio 24, which was kind of like what are known among Latino organizations as La Tienda, the little store. So in that, we made our own products. We imported things from Mexico and Latin America. And we also established consortiums with other Latino organizations in San Francisco. So the Mission Cultural Center, the Mexican Museum, and the Galeria de la Raza, and sometimes La Raza Graphics, all worked together to put on the really big events, like the Days of the Dead. The processional would move from one organization to the other. We would combine our funds and our resources to bring in the Sugar Skull makers or the Linares families who did the Alebrijes. We found a way somehow in those collaborations and consortiums to build funding for the things that we wanted to do. But I have to say that after the fall of NEA, and that took us into the early 90s, there was across our consortium a kind of a collapse. You could really see the beginning and the end of the much smaller organizations. I'm very proud that the Galeria has been able to sustain itself through all those years, offering programs. We've moved into an office now until we get our new building. And on the next panel, Ani Rivera, who is from the Galeria de la Raza, will talk about that mixed-use housing. We're probably the first in our region to do this, to work with municipal and cultural and economic organizations to get on the ground floor of a 9-story building that will have housing for 142 families. And on the ground floor will be 3 community organizations, of which the Galeria is one. So I think that move from the traditional funding, sort of expansion arts funding, into a kind of self-economic model was really not smooth, very difficult. And the second thing that we discovered in terms of our institutional growth was that many of us, kind of like the dinosaurs, the last of our kind, were aging and moving on. Many of our organizations did not build into them healthcare, insurance, or retirement. So all of those things had to be dealt with. And so one of the things that we took it upon ourselves to do which came actually out of work that I did with Lowry and Marta Moreno Vega, which was the idea of the new generation. So I started a program when I got my MacArthur money to fund the beginning of a 3-year program called Regeneration. And so one of the things we discovered, and I think this has been true for all of the organizations that we know well, is that the context, the cultural foundation has changed over the years, not just because of our immigration, but because many of our younger people now are from a more middle-class background. Most of us in the first generation were working class, family who were farm workers, family who were domestics. So moving into that new context, we found that they were more middle class. They were mixed race. They were white and Latino, or black and Latino. They had, or Asian and Latino. And then the part that I think was the most pivotal was the recognition that this new generation was LGBTQ, that we had underestimated, because the patriarchy of our first generation, I just spit it out, it was patriarchal. We did not allow for the rise of women. That came later. That came by the late 70s and 80s, or the place of queerness, because we just didn't have mechanisms for it. So by this time, these new generations came in. That's the bedrock of it. When we did the Regeneration Project, we formed a collective, and they were ages 18 to 35. We allowed anyone in that was interested in, and this came as a result of people like myself and Judy Baca and Pamela Mascaza and others receiving communication over the years from all these young people wanting to know, how did you do it? What was the early movement like? How did you build an institution? And instead of just answering each of them individually, we decided collectively to bring them together. And another part of it had to do with the Frida phenomena. And we're all sick of talking about Frida, but I like talking. So the Frida Kahlo moment at the Galleria was part of that collaboration. So we did the first shows in the window in 75, in one of the pieces I did in 76, the Fifth Sun show in 77, and finally the Homenaje in 1978. So what happened then is that we began to build out these consortiums, and more young people came to us during that period of time. So once we developed the Regeneration Project, we gave over to them the shows for 2 years. We developed teams, curatorial teams, writing teams, educational teams, and we tried to teach them what we had learned, because we were all curators, organic, from the ground up, no training. We had learned how to build educational programs from what we learned as teachers in public school. So once the teams were built, we started developing their shows, and the very first truly queer show was through Regeneration. And then the crux of that is by the end of the 90s, they had begun to take jobs within the Galleria. So it was no longer an external program. And one of the things that they built, and I say the young people built in their own leadership, were these, they were like slams, poetry slams. It became almost like open mics. So that growth from the end of the 90s into 2000, I think set the stage for the next set of leaderships, which would look at issues transgender, bisexual, would look at issues of Central America, which had, I think, not gotten its fair share, and eventually led to people like Ani, who I think have taken on a much more focused engagement with municipal issues. Because as this context of identity changed, the context of the economy changed, particularly in the Mission, as the gentrification took over and more of our community were displaced. They were sent to other places. They couldn't afford the rents. The places that we had lived in were no longer accessible. So I think that our cultural organizations, when they last, or if they are grounded in a community, have to look not just at what they gain from doing this work, but what they give and who they give for. Who are we in service to? Because it's not the same community that Rupert and Richard and I knew in the 70s and 80s. It's not the same community that was in the 90s or the 2000s. We are dealing with something completely different. And in the pandemic, We have to be first responders, helping people find healthcare, helping people get testing, and then helping people find fair housing. Because all of these things are part and parcel of how people live. So art is the vehicle, but really community is the goal. And so I think that our institutions are reforming and renewing themselves. And that's what regeneration was. It was a form of collaborative and collective renewal. And I feel very proud of it because I think, and I keep in touch with many of them, and they're all over the country. They're curators, they're administrators, they're educators, they're university professors. From that ground of maybe 50 young people that began in 1993 and went on, we now see the result of those seeds. And I believe that intergenerational models are really critical to the longevity and sustenance of our community organizations.
Right. We just got a message popped up from Olga Garay, sort of saying about this is a cycle that keeps repeating, and we'll sort of go back to it, later on in our discussion. John, what kinds of institutions have you been working with? I know down where you are, the IAIA is a very important institution, and I wondered about the University of New Mexico there in Albuquerque and things like that. So what kind of organizational things are, and I know you do a lot by yourself. You are a one-person sort of lecturer, demonstrator, and you travel all over the country to sort of do that. So I would love for you to talk about your experience.
Oh, well, there's two things that make my experience different from all the others here. And one is that I don't know if you know about Native American relocation, but during the 1940s and the 1950s, the government wanted to get us off the reservation and assimilate us into mainstream society. They just there's still a plan to get rid of us, okay, as a culture, but and it's really genocidal. But this was major. They took buses to all of our reservations and just loaded people up with a suitcase and took them to the cities and just dumped them. Minneapolis by the thousands, San Francisco, Phoenix, all over this country, New York, all over this country. Native Americans were bussed into these places. So what happened is when I started doing this work, I was flying a lot. To Minneapolis, New York, San Francisco, Seattle, and meeting with other Native American artists. And I was taking shows to mostly community houses, but alternative centers as well. And we had these things called community houses. And the one in New York, which you might know, AIH, the American Indian Community House, that's one that was in the government-funded community house. And for Indian people who were starving, who were desperate, who'd gone to the city, you couldn't make it in the city, maybe came from Alaska, they would give them $50, put them on a bus and send them back to Alaska, or feed them, or sometimes have to put them up. Those are the places that I went to hang work, to bring other artists' work to that community, meet with the artists there, get them together. Often I would feed everybody in Chinatown where the food was cheap. And then I would talk to them about, okay, you guys can organize here. And I would help them do something like that. So I took shows to the Indian Community House, to Peter Jemison in New York, Washington, D.C., to Phoenix, San Francisco, to ICA in San Francisco. Sometimes I served on the boards of these organizations. Atlatl was one in which I would organize exhibitions, and two important ones that I did. There had never been an exhibition of Native American photographs, photography of ourselves. And it took me 5 years to put that together, to find black and white photographs, old Brownie photographs, and make an exhibition. And then when I did it, I couldn't get it in any place. No gallery would take it. No museum would take it. They said they never heard of that. They wanted to know, are they portraits? Like Edward Curtis. And if it wasn't Edward Curtis photographs, portraits, they weren't interested in it. So, so I spent 2 years traveling that exhibition. Eventually, I met a woman in London who was the director of a gallery in Scotland, and talked her into taking a Native American photograph show there. And then it traveled in Europe. Here's what I often did was by networking my way across the country, going to all these college conferences, I would meet Lowry Sims, Lucy Lepard, Margo Machida. I would meet Amalia, and then I would talk to them. And then if they had a little space at their college or university that I might show something, I would say, I've got, and I would talk about some drawings or something, or some women's things, and try to finagle an exhibition on the cheap, like, oh, they just had a cancellation, or maybe they had an empty space or a hallway that I could use. So this is how I was working. I was a bootstrapper. In other words, if I had some money in my pocket and I could pay my plane fare, then I went to any gathering of Native people, and then would visit there and maybe meet a local museum, and then maybe, or university professor, and maybe I could talk them into helping me take a small show. And so sometimes I had shows like traveling Iowa, Indiana. I took all the little podunk museums, and I would travel a show, and I would get a friend in each of these places, somebody I had met at College Art, to take this exhibit. And then I wanted it to go near a reservation so that people could come from the reservation, be in the show, and bring their family. This was a big deal, to see their own work on the wall. And often it was emotional. People would come in and spend the whole evening, all eat together. I loved doing that kind of work. That was community work. That was really the way to go. So I did the first traveling Native women's show in this country with 24 Native women. Some of them are like noted, like Emmy Whitehorse. Oh my God, big important painter. We've got, and from the photograph show, that started careers. I won't name names because.
So how did you get funding support for these projects?
Out of my pocket.
Mm-hmm.
No, yeah, that was one way. But then the other way, like I say, I was nudging or noodling people, like, oh, do you have a space set? And is there any money to pay postage? Oh, I'll pack it up. And, could you use plexiglass on it? Whatever.
I love it.
Whatever I could, whatever. Well, my dad was a horse trader. I'm a horse trader.
I love it. Love it. So I want to go on now to sort of talk about activism on colleges, because many of us went to college, and I know Margo has some ideas about that, and I really want Amalia to talk about her experiences in developing a program at Cal State Monterey. But I need to do a small commercial for tomorrow, just to remind you to tune in and to register for the panel at 6:30 tomorrow, which is Thriving Beyond the Performative, a community plan for small and mid-sized culturally grounded organizations. And this panel is conceived of as the next step after our panel. We've turned it over to the young'uns, and they are going to sort of talk about the strategies that they're sort of talking about to sort of move the movement forward. So be sure I've already registered, so you should too. So we know that activism, as we've heard, grew in service to communities. But in my memory, I guess my first activism was on the college campus. I belonged to the Black Students Union and the Women's Movement, which was sometimes a mutually, they canceled each other out in many interesting ways. So I found myself in different kinds of things, but it was, a way. SDS was there. There was a lot of tension in the late 60s about radicals going to graduate school in Berkeley and places like that. Margo, I know you have a perspective on activism on the campus. And could you talk about your experience? And then I want Amalia to talk about Cal State Monterey.
Yeah, thank you. You know, I have to say that it's a university-based ethnic studies programs of the research institutes that grew out of the student activism in the 60s and 70s that really play a crucial role, then as now, in this historic development of the field. You know, they're the collaborators, the incubators, and archivists, which I want to stress the archive, for cultural work that is still mainly outside the mainstream. And I personally owe them a tremendous debt. They sustained my development as a scholar, as a curator, and an educator. And just to get on a personal note, I mean, a research fellowship in the late 80s from the Asian American Center at Queens College that was directed by the activist historian Jack Chen was what really enabled me to undertake the foundational oral interviews at the studio visits with visual artists on the East Coast. And this kind of artist-centered approach really provided the thematic structure for my first national curatorial project, which was Asia America, Identities in Contemporary Asian American Art. This was mounted in 1994 by the Asia Society Galleries in New York. And here I also want to recognize the leadership of Vishaka Desai, you know, who at that time had just become director of the galleries. Because without her, this probably wouldn't have happened. I mean, so once again, you know, when we look at, you know, our kind of a broader network, extraordinarily important. But anyway, with the fellowship, I also did co-organize a symposium that explored the mixed Afro-Chinese Cuban heritage of the 20th Caribbean artist Wilfredo Lam, who I know that many people, including Lowry, have been researching and involved with. The other thing is that after I received my doctorate in American Studies in 2002, I obtained a joint faculty appointment in art history and Asian American Studies. And so, you know, this is what enabled me to gain a foothold in the academy. Because, you know, I consider myself to be, like many folks here, kind of a non-traditional scholar. I mean, I didn't start school when I was, you know, very young and go straight through. I mean, our paths are winding, goes through many, many different communities. We work for many organizations. I mean, this is a long path that I don't think we have time for. But anyway, I just wanted to say that this, and I guess, by the way, I just also want to add something of the funding thing is that, you know, all along, foundation support, like the Rockefeller Foundation, extraordinarily important to funding this type of work. Somebody had given a shout out, I guess it was Amalia had mentioned Tomas Ibarra Frausto before. And the visionary work of people who are scholars, curators, activists from within the foundation sector, key, you know, to this, to be able to advance this dialogue.
Well, I think you made it. Yeah, I just wanted to. Margo made an important point. I'm sorry, I'm getting feedback. Margo made an important point about, you know, who was on the staff of the foundations at the time, and Tomas was like just exemplary in sort of making, you know, things happen, and even Darren Walker, you know, when he was on the staff of the Rockefeller and Ford before he became president. You know, these are the type of people who could make a catalytic intervention that was really important. And so we can't, while we have many issues with what foundations do and evolve into and what they're trying to do now with social justice, we can't forget the individuals, you know, like who were there and really did a yeoman job of getting that. Amalia, you wanted to say something, yes?
Yeah, I especially want to step in now because the program that we had at Cal State University, Monterey Bay, we still have the Visual and Public Art program in collaboration with Music and Performing Arts that my husband Richard Baines ran. We could not have done that work with first Lila Wallace, but most importantly, the incredible late Claudine Brown. Claudine Brown, which was at Nathan Cummings Foundation, once said to me, you know, Amalia, you really can't expect an output from a program if you don't fund it for at least 10 years as a funder. And she gave us almost 8. And so the program that I'm talking about, Visual and Public Art, was originally founded, and just for people to understand, California State University is a university in the CSU system, but it was Swords into Plowshares. It used to be Fort Ord, which was from the 1900s on, but a staging ground during the Vietnam War. And it has ghosts, to be sure, in the ground. I mean, there is energy there. Jean was one of our first visiting artists in the very first year. So we began officially in 1997, but we started in 1995. And it was founded by Judy Baca and Suzanne Lacey. So all power to those gals, because they set a blueprint that was really quite amazing. And I took over as its first director in 1997. I stayed almost 12 years. And our philosophy was one of community and social justice commitment, that art is for someone and we do it with a purpose. So we had a curriculum that spanned everything from how to run community workshops and how to develop proposals for public projects, as well as your own aesthetic development. But it was always grounded in the idea of partnerships with the community. And at one point we had partnerships with almost 20 organizations across our region, everyone from the Boys and Girls Club to the AIDS partnerships to those for dropouts. And we found that we were able to do work that no one else could do. We could buy billboards and put up signs affirming the right of farm workers to have fair housing, things that couldn't be done any other way, not through politics, but through art. And so that original program eventually transformed itself in collaboration with American Indian College, with Maryland Institute College of Art, Columbia College of Art in Chicago. We had Xavier University in New Orleans. We had all kinds of different organizations that we were partnered with, which led us to even the capacity to develop a network called the Community Arts Convening and Research. So we published a book, we published community newsletters, and we were able to formulate and strategize ways in which these teaching models could be passed on. But I do say that I think in the end, it really had to do with the lived experience of people who build these programs. You know, all of us, and that included Johanna Pothik and Stephanie Johnson and many others, we had come into higher education through programs in which we learned nothing about working in community. We learned how to be artists, we learned about technique, whatever, but we learned nothing about how to work beyond ourselves. And so when we made this program, it was a coalition of the lived experience of Judy Baca, Suzanne Lacey, Johanna Pothik, myself, and Stephanie. And I look back on now the golden years when we were getting probably $150,000 a year, and we could collaborate across all these fields. That doesn't exist anymore. But we had people like Bell Hooks and Sandra Cisneros, and we had, you know, Fred Wilson and Pepon Osorio and Carmen Lomas Garza. We had Lowry Sims in our museum program. We were able to bring in people who were operating really at the highest level. Jack Chen helped us with our Asian community organizations. I look back on it now, and I know that it was an artifact of a time, but what Lowry said was really true. If Claudine Brown had not been there, and if she had not worked first in the Smithsonian, which she went back to later, we would never have had the kind of support that allowed us to do that work. Now our funding streams are quite different, and the organizations that we support are very much the same, but even our visiting artist models have changed. Over the years, we bring in much younger artists, mid-career, collaborative, DigniCraft, all of these different cross-border Mexico-US border groups. We are able to do the work for the new generation in the new time. But it's not easy. We're as a university, as a Cal State, always kind of wobbly. And right now, of course, we're locked down completely. So we're hoping that all of us will come out of this on the other end being stronger. But I really learned this as an artist. Some of the places that will take the greatest risk with artists are university museums and galleries. The mainstream has its own sort of world, and rarely do we break into that. And if we do, we never get past a certain level. But the universities not only have the resources, but they give us access to students, and we learn from the students. So I think that all of our community-based organizations would be well pressed to continue partnering with universities, because at this juncture, when we come out of this, we're all going to be on rocky ground economically, and we're all going to need to build partnerships across all these different sectors if we're going to be able to keep doing the work for the people who so much need us.
Right.
You're right. So, John, Napoleon, please.
No, I was just going to add on to what Amalia said and something that John had said, is that AfriCOBRA, unlike some of the other institutional structures or entities, we were, I would say, a nomadic institution in the sense that most of us have taught at different colleges and universities throughout our careers. And as a result, we have educated and influenced and encouraged and promoted many thousands of young people through all of the courses we've taught for all these years at the universities and colleges that we've taught. Jeff left Chicago and went to Howard University, which was the base of AfriCOBRA in a way of speaking, as the chair of the department. And ultimately, when he passed away, he was the dean of the School of Art. But we, through our teaching, and Nelson taught for over 35 years at UMass Amherst, and with a multitude of great minds and creative individuals who were resident up there, Archie Shepp, Max Roach, Chinua Achebe, James Baldwin. I mean, living here in Boston, I was up there all the time. So we as nomads, and using each other's relationships in the different institutions that we taught at, traveled exhibitions of our work or other artists' works or students' work. And we would travel through those institutions and spend time with all of our colleagues at these different institutions. If we were in town on an MFA lecture, we made sure that everyone we knew that taught at a junior college or some other university who didn't have the dime to pay for us to come, they got a part of that dollar that we got from those institutions to go there and share our work, because we all travel with images of our work and other our students' work and so forth. And so in a sense, we have, in a kind of, I would call it a nomadic context, have done an institutional building and spreading cultivation of the creative energies for 40 years, and so we still, some people say, I didn't know AfriCOBRA was still around. Well, we will be around until we are no longer around,
John, did you have any specific, I know you've taught, any specific perspectives on the place of universities in terms of activism and sort of passing on your values to students and things?
Well, I have, I've done a lot of printmaking workshops, and I've, had residences like come in and stay for a week, and they brought me into history classes, all different kinds of classes, to talk about Native Americans, because often they would say to me they'd never seen a Native American or they didn't know any. So it was sort of, I never passed myself off as representing all Native Americans, because that's just not a possible thing. We have 570 tribes that are recognized, and we have hundreds that are not recognized. So we never talk about the indigenous diaspora, but in this country, if we drew a map of all of this, it would be like the African Caribbean diaspora. We have this all the way to Patagonia. So, but what I did want to say is that we have a unique situation with Native America in that because it was thought that Native Americans could not be taught or trained because we weren't as intelligent as other people. And so the government set about in the turn of the century having white women come out here to the Southwest and create kind of small organizations like making pottery or weaving or something like that, and then selling it at the train stations. So there's a whole story about that. But out of that, these rich white women who came from back east became major collectors of these crafts.
Yes.
And then they would donate those to the museums for a big tax write-off. And so the museums that collected so-called Indian art collected weavings, jewelry, pottery, baskets. And when we came along, those of us who went to college, we were the first ones in our families to go to college. And from 1930s early on and into the 1950s and 1960s, when the John Hay Whitney Fellowship created IAIA, the Institute in Santa Fe, the Indian College in Santa Fe, which I was on the board for, and it was going down the tubes.
Yeah.
The Bureau of Indian Affairs owned it, and so I flew to Washington on my own money, and not knowing what I was doing in all naivete, went to legislators' offices like Richardson and Domenici, begging for the life of this school and what could I do to save it. And they told me I could do a letter writing campaign, and also include it as a writer in legislation. So I got Dale Kildee's assistant, Alan Lovesey, to write this legislation. And I did the letter writing campaign with Karita Coffey and Linda Lomahaftua licking stamps with me. And we sent it out to Women's Art Caucus and a lot of places like that. And by golly, we did get the school to be a line item, like the African American College and like Gallaudet. And so that was 50 years ago. But to this day, no one's ever said, thank you, Jean. That was a good thing. Hundreds. I mean, hundreds.
Thank you, John.
And my son has a job there. He thanks me all the time. And, so I saved that school's little butt. But those kinds of things, that takes partly stupidity and naivete to accomplish those, because there's just no knowing how to do that. But for Indian art, there is this traditional Indian art, and then contemporary, which is bastardized, inauthentic. So these white collectors saw me as inauthentic, and I wasn't authenticated as a Native person who followed tradition. So in our community, we have this that Latins don't have, Hispanics don't have, African Americans have some, and they have their own battles with that, their own issues. But we really had it major, big time. So the Heard Museum asked me to come and consult with them to do an exhibition, and it was going to be like 10 best Native painters. And I was like so against that. All it does is it helps the galleries make money, does nothing for Indian people, didn't help us at all. I knew I would be in the show. It would have been, a nice thing. I felt, though, if we every other year did an exhibition with contemporary Natives, we could teach the board, who are always all white doctors and lawyers, we could teach the community about contemporary Indian art and let them see that we are real Native Americans, that we come from reservations, and that we are authentic. And so they went for it, and they did it for 10 years. I wanted them to collect from every show, which they did not do. But now, today, they've got a cutting-edge exhibition at the Heard Museum. And in the book, by the way, they gave me credit. Ta-da! That talks about how I came over and changed their minds and encouraged them to do this exhibition biennial. And I did the same thing at the Idle Jorg. Theirs is still going, that fellowship. And then we have another one. I gave money and my art collection to the Missoula Art Museum. And when they built the new section onto the museum, they created a wing just for contemporary Native art. No baskets, no jewelry, for contemporary work. And so I feel like hundreds of Indians, hundreds, maybe thousands, have been served in just these 3 locations. I mean, this in my lifetime, this is major.
Sounds great. All right, I think we want to wrap it up and see if we have a few minutes for questions. So I think I wanted to ask you all if you were to leave a perspective on what needs to happen today and what you would suggest of the next phase of the work for the next generation to do. I know some of you have projects doing that. John, maybe you want to talk about the book with Thames and Hudson, you know, and Napoleon and Margo and Amalia may have things. We'll give Amalia the last one because she is our reverend who sort of really can wrap things up. But John, you want to talk about the new book that you're working on?
Well, I've been working on this new book for 20 years.
Right. That's how new it is. The new old book that you're working on.
Well, see, I started like writing some stuff and collecting images 20 years ago and approaching publishers. Every time I went to College Art Association or anytime I knew saw that there was a new publisher, you know, I would contact them and say, you know, what you really need is a book on contemporary Native American art, because there is no such thing. Not even today. There is no, I can go on the web and there'll be 70, 80 books on African American art. There'll be another 30 books on Asian art. No, not on contemporary Native art. There is no such thing.
So you're working on that.
What?
You're working on a book.
Well, I'm still on it. I mean, I'm still asking.
Tell us where you are with this project, honey.
I can't. Well,
end is near.
I now at one College Art Association, I went into this booth and told them my sad tale of woe, and they said, "Well, are there enough of you that you?" said, "Oh," I said, "Give me a piece of paper and a pencil," and I started writing. Like, okay. I started writing like this, and I said, "And there's where this 50 came from. There's another 300." And they said, "Oh, really?" And so they talked to me a little bit and then talked to me a little bit more. So now I've written a proposal with Mario Caro and my son, and it's off in London, and I'm waiting to hear. I'm not saying this is a done deal yet. Okay. So, but I do have one of my art mavens, you know, on the proposal here, Ms. Lowry Sims herself, been supportive of our community for 35, 40 years. And we, you know, I still need her.
All right. No, I know I can't retire. All right, fine.
Yeah,
okay.
No, you can't retire.
Okay, good. All right. So
I need you.
All right. So Napoleon, I understand that you have an archive of the era. What are you going to do with that archive, my friend?
Well, I am in the process, which I have been similar to John. I've been in the process well over 10 years, trying to put some order to all of this stuff I've collected since 1968, I would say, coming forward. But I would bring one's attention to the fact that in 2018, AfriCOBRA published a catalog of celebrating our 50th anniversary, and it has a rather extensive history of AfriCOBRA from 1968 to 2018. And we are currently collecting all of our individual data into really working on putting together a catalog raisonné of AfriCOBRA's 50 years plus. And so any and everyone who's listening on this program with us tonight who has anything of any AfriCOBRA artist, my contact information is connected to the site. Please do get in touch with me. We would like to know where all those works are, and we are busily working with that. We also have 5 other catalogs that have been produced of exhibitions we've had over, starting with our 20th anniversary coming forward. So that's what we're presently in the process of doing, and trying to put together a large traveling exhibition in the next 4 or 5 years.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
There you go. Now, Margo, you're working on a project with Carlos, honoring Carlos Villa, right?
Oh,
Well, tell us about your projects. Oops.
Because, you know, we were talking about Godzilla
Yeah.
originally, and I was thinking about its significance as kind of a touchstone for non-institutional ways of doing things that I know that Napoleon also touched on very extensively. And then, you know, this idea of the volunteer organization, the idea of doing it sort of bootstraps, the idea of projects that don't necessarily become institutional. So I think that, you know, rather than kind of obviating the demand for traditional institutions, what these developments kind of point to is like they're sort of fertile possibilities for like multi-sided arts activism, which I think is something that has really been a thread throughout our discussion. That, you know, I think particularly now in these incredibly challenging times, you really do be flexible to think about other means, of multiple means, to bring people of color together in the arts and to create these platforms for visibility and dialogue that are not wholly dependent on a permanent brick and mortar presence. Because, I mean, you know, it's been kind of the gold standard when we think about, you know, where we'd like to be. And, you know, not to say that we don't need these places, but there's also other strategies. And I wanted to just mention two things. These are both things I've been involved with, but one of them is this experientially driven hybrid approach that was advanced by the curatorial team of the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center in Washington. It was a concept of the migratory museum. But you know what it was? So first of all, I should say that this is a Ford Foundation initiative. So I mean, again, we get back to this question about funding. But what they were was there were 4 pop-up events that were held. It was between 2016 and 19. But these convenings of the term culture labs brought together, you know, Asian, non-Asian, and indigenous cultural practitioners from the U.S. and the Pacific region. And the idea was to directly engage with communities. And where were they? It was like D.C., New York, Honolulu, and last one was Auckland, New Zealand, Aotearoa. But it's anchored in this commitment. Like if you go on their website, they have a manifesto about this, about a commitment to social justice work. And the aim was to foster culturally sensitive and respectful encounters between different people. But in that, you know, again, it points to the face-to-face, the importance of that relationship building that we've been talking about for a while. And on the scholarly front, there are web-based initiatives like the Digital Humanities Project, such as the Virtual Asian American Art Museum, which I've also been doing. This was launched in 2018 under the aegis of the NYU Asian Pacific American Institute. But it's a really powerful tool where you can generate, you can share new research, in this case on Asian American art and art history, but it's got a worldwide network that they're slowly building up of all these curators and scholars and artists. And then the Carlos Villa project, yes, there's a big exhibition coming up next year that is going to feature. Now, Carlos Villa is an interesting artist in many respects. And one of the things, you look at the entirety of his career as an activist, as an educator, that, you know, as an organizer, that you begin to get a feeling for this, you know, multi-sided work. It's a very powerful model, as I was mentioning before. So be on the lookout for that. It's coming. But anyway, I just wanted to say that, you know, if I look back, you know, sort of this really circuitous path in my practice took, I consider myself so incredibly fortunate to have found these supportive spaces and the relationships with people who are pursuing kindred interests at this really critical moments in time. And I think especially now, I mean, there's this real imperative to reach out and to recommit to working together on the cultural front. And it's really pressing as we all know this, but when you look at the spiraling xenophobia, you look at this isolationism, the punishing anti-immigrant policies, appalling incidents of racially motivated violence, and all these societal inequities that are thrown into such sharp relief by the COVID pandemic. I mean, you're so right when you're pointing to this thing, the importance of creating cohorts. That is so crucial to sustaining our work. It's spiritually and strategically, both. And that especially if you're dealing with what is still non-canonical and historically marginalized art and artists. And so our fields are brought together and survive because of the interventions of dedicated people, like all folks here in this panel today. And so it requires this like tenacious commitment to cultivate what I consider these fluidly resilient alliances within and also across our communities, and then working together towards change. Thank you.
Thank you, Margo. Amalia, my darling, bring us on home.
Well, can I just segue from Carlos Villa? Carlos was one of the dearest people in my life as a friend and as a collaborator. He was one of those people when he would call you up in that little voice and he'd say, Amalia, I have this idea. And then you just go reporting for duty. And you just would do whatever he asked you. And it was always brilliant and always thoughtful and never a person who put himself forward in this grandiose way, quietly working to bring people together. And I really echo what Margo has said, and with everyone, which is, we cannot do this alone. There was somebody who said something about the wandering path, and I was thinking as we listened to each other over this long conversation is that we have all had meandering and wandering paths, begun usually in some form of racism and discrimination, some form of family, dysfunctional, functional, whatever it may be, and eventually to one another, to collaborations and cooperative endeavors and community. When I was talking earlier about our program at the university, one of the things we based a lot of our work on was the theories on cultural citizenship, which are extremely meaningful to me now in this era of anti-immigrant and sort of, babies in cages. And the cultural citizenship model, which was developed by William Flores, Rina Ben-Mayor, and the great teacher Renato Rosaldo, really looked at citizenship as a social practice, not a legal paradigm. And in that social practice, people have the right to the space. They can claim their space, and they earn their space by their contributions to the larger society, whether that's the food they grow or the things they make, or how it is that they give love and care to other people. And so I think that in many ways, our lives have been lives of cultural citizenship, and our meandering paths have taken us sometimes to the same place. I would say that being here under the Creative Justice Initiative is an echo of the early years where Marta Moreno Vega and the Caribbean Cultural Center put together cultural diversity through cultural grounding. And that terminology was set in place to confront the appropriation that was happening in the late 80s and early 90s when mainstream institutions were sort of stealing our Rolodexes and having, big shows that happened every 10 years. We used to say you wouldn't know you were Latino except every 10 years. And in between you'd have cultural amnesia because nobody ever talks about you in the intervening years. So we're at a new point now. And I guess that my job is sort of pass the baton. I do want to say that this experience today, even with people who I've known for 30 years, was really quite amazing and very profound. We are all unique in our ways, even though we have had some collective moments, and certainly our personal pathways, meandering as they have never been easy. We were the first almost always, knocking on the door, kicking the door, whatever it took. And we tried to open up the larger society for our communities, but we also tried to take care of our communities. And so we sort of ended up going back and forth between the larger art world and the community-based world. And sometimes it was confusing, and often it was depleting, and it made some of us ill. And we've had years and years of trying to heal ourselves while healing our communities. But I think we're at a precipice now, and everything that we've talked about, from the pandemic to the racial injustice and Black Lives Matters, the immigration crisis, whatever you want to call it. We're at a precipice. And years ago, people would talk about the fact that when the moment of change came, there would be a huge white patriarchal backlash. And we would have to survive that to move to that new age. And we are dead center in the middle of it right now. And so I look at what we've done as a sort of constancy. We've tried to keep at it. Look at Napoleon on his own, so much of the time doing, that archive, trying to keep that going. Jean sticking her hand in her pocket, jumping on a plane, advocating. Margo being the only one speaking from the position sometimes of the Asian diaspora in Hawaii. And Lowry, you've walked over the coals from the Met to the studio to May to all of it. You walked on the coals and you did it for us. So that idea of our constancy and legacy means we need to not necessarily step aside, although sometimes I think we do, but we definitely need to hand the baton. And the new youth, and they're not even so young, but they're way younger than we are, but the new communities that have come out of our older ones are being led by such savvy young people, many of them women actually, savvy young people who have backgrounds in public policy, international law. They know what has to be done. And our job, I think, is to make sure that the legacy of those earlier efforts is available to them, whether it's through archives, whether it's the books that get produced, whatever's the reason, because they will need that history just as we need their future. And I've often written about the concept of remembering the future. And that's what we're in the process of doing today. We have been remembering the future. And that panel that comes tomorrow will be amazing because they're going to talk about everything from the mixed use housing issues to the public policy issues to health issues to the new generation of artists to global hemispheric partnerships. For everything that we need to sustain us, we have someone there, someone coming. Walter Benjamin said in his writings that, and I'm poorly paraphrasing it, but he said, the dead have a hold on us. They have an agreement with us that cannot be cheaply paid. They knew we were coming and they are waiting for us. And that's how I feel. We're still here, but those who came before us, the Carlos Villas of the world, they did this so we would be here. And we do this so they will be there. So I think remembering the future, being present in every way that we can, and remembering that in this really terrible time, it's very painful. Every day is painful. We have to find ways to sustain ourselves. Part of the reason we're having these conversations with the larger communities is we're having them with ourselves. Because we need to know that we can keep going, and we need to know that the richness of our experiences in that meandering pathway has brought us hope and has brought us to this future. So I hope that everyone has enjoyed the day. I know I have, and I thank Marta Moreno Vega, I thank Lowry, and I thank Olga Chapman, and all the people who have helped to organize this. It has been very, very enlightening and nourishing, and we need that. We need that healing and that cultural nutrients, because we're the only ones that can give it to each other. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that comes through collaboration, agitation, and respect.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'd like to take this opportunity before I thank you all to say that I've been nudging Amalia and Lowry because it is very clear that our stories are yet to be told and yet to be documented.
Yes.
And it is our responsibility to do that, to tell our stories. No one can tell the story of John like John, or Margo like Margo, Napoleon like Napoleon, Lowry, Amalia. And there are many stories that are yet to be documented, right? We were only able to get 5 of us to have a discussion, right? And I stepped out because I wanted to make sure that there was time to make the discussion rich and full. But we have to understand that as we pass on the baton, as Amalia calls it, the story has to be there for them and the future generations to have the resources from our mouths, not from someone else's mouth. Our
Right.
stories are always told by others. It has to be told by us.
Yes, that's
Definitely.
correct.
So we
We
have to
are
make
the
that
bridge.
commitment.
Marta, we are the bridge between the ancestors and the young people.
Yes.
Yes.
Good point.
Absolutely. And before we become the ancestors, we need to tell
Yeah.
our stories from our voices.
Right.
So that I thank you, Napoleon, John, Margo, Amalia, Lowry. And I should say I met Amalia in Europe and we were fighting against white supremacy. And I always heard that there was somebody on the West Coast that was the Chicana version of me. And she heard the same thing. And Lowry has always been a sister, and Napoleon, beautiful, beautiful being in your space. So I look forward to our work together. Margo, thank you for your writings in achieving cultural equity. And as we move forward and plan the future, as we document what we have done, and let's make the commitment that we will do this, document our stories and pass them on.
And John,
Thank you.
and
Thank
John.
you.
And
And I'm sure that you're hearing the clapping in your soul because this was absolutely amazing. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you.
See you tomorrow.
So tomorrow we will have the second part of this panel, which is driving beyond the performative, a community plan for small and mid-sized culturally grounded organizations. And the information is on the poster. So we'll see you tomorrow at 6:30 to continue the conversation. So thank you for being with us. Be safe.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. You guys are wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you.